One topic that frequently comes up in the discussions of whether a church can exist or cannot exist is the question of canonical territories. Again, let's substitute the word administrative for the word canonical, and let's look at administrative territories. Of course, any administration is empowered by the legal system that is maintained by a given state. Canada cannot exert an administrative aspect over some American state, just as America cannot exert an administrative aspect over some province of Canada. The same thing existed back at the time of the Byzantine Empire. When the empire expanded, it administered a larger portion of land. When the boundaries of the empire shrunk, the land it administered became smaller. It is interesting to note that even when territories in Africa were reconquered, the church was not allowed under the Byzantine emperor to automatically resume administering what it had administered before. This is very interesting because it shows that the canonical territory is not something that is decided by the church, but is decided by the emperor, a secular authority. And it was the emperor with his holy and sacred edict or law or canon who gave back the territories for the church to administer. And of course, the Church of Constantinople has a long history of administering different lands, and how it administered those lands has changed throughout history. Under the Byzantine emperor, one way of administering the lands existed. When Byzantium, Constantinople, was conquered by the Turks, in the Ottoman Empire, there was a different system of administering the various lands where the church existed. And in a funny historical way, the Orthodox Church actually managed or administered more lands, speaking geographically, under the Ottoman Empire than it actually did under the Byzantine emperors. Byzantium was always shrinking, especially in the Balkans, where new peoples were arriving, and the Slavs, the Serbs, the Bulgarians from Asia, the Romanians, the Hungarians, all of these peoples were moving in, taking over the land, and shrinking what was Byzantium. But under the Turks, these regions were all consolidated as part of the as part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Church of Constantinople ruled over these people. The Sultan gave the Patriarch the right to rule and administer, both in a secular, in a religious, and even in a judicial manner, the people of the Christian nation. All Christians belonged to one nation, and whether they were Greeks or Serbs or, God forbid, Macedonians or Bulgarians, who were inveterate enemies of the Byzantine Empire, as were the Serbs, they were all administered within the Ottoman Empire by the Church of Constantinople. Now, something happens when World War I ends and the Ottoman Empire falls apart. For the first time in 1600 years, the Church of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarch, is left without any territories to administer. He was not canonical in Greece. He was no longer canonical in the Balkans. He was not canonical in Eastern Europe. He was not canonical in the Middle East. He was not canonical in Northern Africa. And that is when this new idea that he is canonical in the New World, in the new territories that none of the other churches had administered in the past. But I'd like to go back and sort of discuss this strange relationship between the old patriarchs. Obviously, of the Pentarchy, the oldest patriarchate, we could say, is that of Jerusalem, because that is where the apostles began their missionary work. However, because of history, because of the Jewish rebellions against Roman rule, Jerusalem at one point in time was razed to the ground. The city ceased to exist. It was erased from the map. Rome, being the capital of the Roman Empire, became the next most important center for Christian development, and the Bishop of Rome became the most important patriarch. We also have Alexandria, which was the sort of capital of Africa in the Roman Empire. We also have Antioch, which was an important center within the Middle East on the Asian continent. And it was quite late in the history, even after Constantine started to rebuild Jerusalem as a Christian city, after the Holy Cross was discovered in Jerusalem. Only then did he lay the foundation for Constantinople. And it is interesting to look at the canons, because you can see how over the years, from one ecumenical council to the next, certain ideas develop. Again, this is just an aside. Very often the average person believes that the canons arose perfectly from day one. We know that the creed, the statement of our faith, that was written at the time of the First Ecumenical Council in 325, it was revised at a later date. So, even the creed did not emerge in its perfect form the first time. There were revisions. The same thing with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It began to evolve, and it began to search for its administrative territory over the centuries. Then there was the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. The Pentarchy, with its symbolic meaning of the head and the four limbs of the body of Christ, was left without a limb or without a head. And for several centuries, Christendom, Eastern Christendom, was in search of a fifth patriarchate. And along came Moscow, and it established the Moscow Patriarchate, and suddenly the Pentarchy was symbolically complete again. And now comes the interesting question: what are the canonical territories of the Patriarchate of Moscow? And we tend to argue about the history of Ukraine. And we tend to forget that the current boundaries of the country were not quite the same way in previous centuries. As early as 1507, Moscow gained control of the easternmost territories of Ukraine. Kharkiv, Poltava, further south, southeast. And it was a gradual process by which the boundary began to move further and further west. A process that did not end until just prior to World War I, when the most western part of Ukraine, Volhynia, was being converted from Greek Catholicism to Orthodoxy. If we go back in time to 1685, when the Moscow Patriarchate received the Kiev Metropolia from the Ecumenical Patriarch, and Ukraine became part of the Moscow Patriarchate, we have to understand that at that time it was only left bank Ukraine that was transferred to Moscow. So even if we argue that the canonical territory of the Moscow Patriarchate has to be respected, that political transfer of territory, of power, of administration, of canonicity from the Ecumenical Patriarch to the Patriarch of Moscow did not include right bank Ukraine. But politically, as the boundaries of the Russian Empire expanded, so did its administrative power of the Church expand. And it becomes very interesting after World War I, when Poland took over the western portions of Ukraine, and the Ecumenical Patriarch recognized the autocephalous Church of Poland, the Orthodox Church of Poland is autocephalous, and established its canonical territories. All of these western lands were given to the Polish autocephalous Orthodox Church. After World War II, when the boundaries again changed, these western Ukrainian lands were administered by Moscow. Patriku, to робить звук. Так? Прошу. Не качати. Which becomes an interesting argument because Moscow never recognized the granting of autocephaly in the 1920s to the Polish Orthodox Church, and the Ecumenical Patriarch never recognized the changed boundaries of the Polish autocephalous Orthodox Church after World War II. And none of these problems would exist today if the patriarchates agreed that administratively churches in the old world should have their boundaries superimposed upon the political boundaries of modern states. The Russian Orthodox Church exists in Russia. The Polish Orthodox Church exists in Poland. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church as an autocephalous church exists in the state of Ukraine. But obviously, these patriarchates have their political agendas, the ecumenical patriarch cannot exist within the state of Turkey because of the Muslim nature of the country. So the ecumenical patriarch is trying to expand into North America, Central America, South America, Australia, Oceania, Eastern Asia, and the Russian Patriarchate, with the ever-increasing presence of Muslim citizens even in Moscow, is trying to expand the same way into Western Europe, into North America, Central America, South America, Australia, Oceania, Southeast Asia, as they try to establish a global presence. As far as the ecumenical patriarch is concerned, this is the so-called Orthodox world, which Metropolite Yuri of the UOCC has referenced on many occasions, where he has challenged the faithful of our church. Do you want to be part of the Orthodox world or not? And most people think that this is a discussion whether we have a choice between orthodoxy and being unorthodox. But it's actually a decision where we have to be asking ourselves, do we choose to be part of the Greek, Hellenic, Byzantine world of orthodoxy or not? Similarly, the Moscow Patriarchate has its version known as the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. Or do we want to be part of that world? And at the end of the day, my question is simply, why can't we be part of the Ukrainian world? The Bulgarian church, together with the Bulgarian government, has expanded into Western Europe just as much as the Russians have been doing. They're expanding into the New World because, as the Prime Minister said recently, with 20% of the population of Bulgaria having emigrated and created a worldwide diaspora, it is important that the church remain that national, cultural, ideological center of reference for the Bulgarian people. The Russians are doing it, the Greeks are doing it, the Ukrainians should be doing it. But the moment the Ukrainians are doing it, oh my goodness, we are idolatrous. We are doing something that is going to damn our souls. And again, it becomes this vicious psychological attack that is directed at Ukrainians. And the Brotherhood stands up to defend the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We can do that within Canada. We can try and influence with our educational programs the course of how people think in other countries, but our primary object is to defend the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada the way it has been in the past as an autocephalous entity, and to make sure that when we talk about its canonicity, we are talking about the canonicity within Canadian law, within Canadian society, and within Canadian culture.